Okay, hi Priyam, nice to meet you. Can you start by giving me a quick introduction of your project?
My project's name is My Unique School. It is about my school, South Poplar Traditional Elementary, and it is called My Unique School because in this project I'm exploring why my school is unique and what makes it so unique.
Thank you. Would you like to start by showing us your presentation slides?
Yep, I will be sharing my screen now. Just a second.
Yeah, no worries.
Good afternoon. Today I will be presenting to you my Heritage Fair project, My Unique School. We will begin with the introduction. I will introduce myself and explain the reason I chose this topic. Next are the fun facts. Facts about South Poplar that I learned through the course of this project. Then comes Then versus Now, which is comparing South Poplar in the 1900s to now. Next, we will have the history of South Poplar, in which I will show how South Poplar was built and why it was built, along with details about its creation. As well, there's the conclusion and acknowledgements. The conclusion will show what I learned through the course of this project, and the acknowledgements will be thanking the people that made this project happen. Let's jump right in. Introduction. Hi, I'm Priyam. I am a grade 5 student at South Poplar Traditional Elementary School, and I chose to investigate why my school is unique due to the deep personal connection my family and I have to the school, as well as the very strong roots it has formed in Abbotsford. Nelson Mandela once said, "Education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world." Fun fact. There were no indoor facilities such as toilets, running water, or heating. Students would use special pens called nibs. Those nibs would require ink, and so the students would have ink wells. In the winter, the ink in the ink wells would freeze. Students that did not live close to the school would have to bring a horse to school, as there were no alternative modes of transport. They would bring feed and water along with their own lunch, and feed the horse during lunchtime. There were many restrictions for female teachers. For example, they had to be unmarried. They were allowed 1 hour social time per week with a female friend. They were also not allowed to show any skin. They would wear a long skirt, long stockings, and have their hair done up. Students used to get punished with a strap or a ruler if they were misbehaving. There would be a small stove in the classroom to provide heat. It was the student's job to bring firewood for the stove at the start of the day and water at the end of the day to put it out. In 1992, there were only 2 portables on the school grounds, neither of which had heat, AC, or running water and toilets. South Poplar has only been traditional since 2002. It was down to 93 students and about to close down. The parents and the staff worked together to encourage enrollment. This strategy was switching to traditional, which quickly got far better results than they planned. Then versus now. In the 1900s, as mentioned in the fun fact slide, students would use nib pens with inkwell. Now, students use graphite pencils or ballpoint pens. Back then, students had thin wooden rulers with inches only, as centimeters were not used. Now, there are metal or plastic rulers with markings in inches and centimeters. Like I said in the fun fact, students would take horses to school. Now, almost every student is driven to school. In the 1930s, students would use a book strap, a belt-like strap to wrap around their books, making them easier to carry. Now, almost every student has a backpack. They would also use a lard pail to carry their lunch, as opposed to now as there are lunch kits. How my school grew gradually. In the 1900s, there was no electricity in the school. In the 1950s, one TV for 5 classrooms to share. And now, there's enough Chromebooks and iPads for 4 classrooms, as well as smartboards and TVs. In the 1900s, there were only around 30 students to a school. In the 1950s, that number grew to around 50 students. And now there's over 200 students, and counting. In the 1900s, students only had 1 bucket of drinking water per day, provided by the janitor. In the 1990s, water fountains with unlimited water were introduced. And now there's metal water fountains as well as automatic water bottle fillers. Here are some pictures of my school. In the 1920s, you can see a picture of a stove in the middle. And the desk that the students were working on had wooden skids. The skids would be used to make moving the desks more easy. This is a picture from the 1990s, as there were no uniforms yet. And now this is a picture of my own classroom. As you can see, there are students with headphones and working on Chromebooks. Here is a picture from the 1920s of the old schoolhouse. Over here is a picture of what it would have looked like in the 1950s, as that was when they switched over to a main school building. And now this is a picture taken from the upper parking lot of the main school building. In the 1900s, students had chalkboards and chalk. In the 1950s, whiteboards and markers were introduced, and now there's smartboards and projectors. Here are some former school staff members. On the left is Mr. James S. Reed, the first principal, and on the right is Miss Joan Campbell, who is the mother of Mrs. Helen Singer, and Ike and Elsie Berg, early janitors at South Poplar. The history of South Poplar. In 1932, South Poplar started being built. In 1933, it first opened its doors. And in 1934, the poplar trees that still surround the school were planted under the direction of Mr. James S. Reed by pupils. In 2002, it was struggling with enrollment, had only 93 students, and was about to close its doors. And now, it has over 200 students. Building South Poplar. When South Poplar was first built in 1932, the school was 1 classroom with a basement for firewood storage, and it served as a makeshift play area on rainy days. All of this cost $12,000. However, that number today would be $23,000. Why is South Poplar unique? Parents and even teachers were excited to be part of something new, in this case a traditional school. The families experienced what South Poplar was like, and after seeing that South Poplar was an excellent school, they were more than eager to register. This is a picture of families camping outside in their trailers to enroll their own kids. These are some interviews that I took with my teachers. This is Mrs. Karen Rogers, a teacher who has been teaching at South Poplar for quite a long time. Personal connections. Everything is connected. Here, as you can see, is Mrs. Helen Singer, who was a former student in the 1950s. Her mother, Mrs. Joan Campbell, was a former janitor at South Poplar. Then there's Mr. Ray Stobie. His father was a former student. And Mr. Ray Stobie, he was a former grade 5 teacher. And he taught his own cousins and his nieces and nephews. And then there's Mrs. Heather Peters. She was a former student and a grade 4-5 teacher. Her aunt, Linda Kimber, was a former student at South Poplar, and her daughters were also former students. Conclusion. In conclusion, for the past 88 years, South Poplar has been an important part of our community, growing and changing over the years. Acknowledgements. Thank you so much to Mr. Dwayne Penner, who is the principal of South Poplar, Mrs. Heather Peters, Mrs. Sharon Huguet, Mrs. Shay Iverson, Mrs. Asha James, and Mrs. Karen Rogers for information. And a special thank you to Mr. Ray Stobie for an email interview. Thank you to the Reach Gallery for photos, as well as the Heritage House. And the books that I used for my project were Heart of the Fraser Valley, Time Flies, Abbotsford and Mission, and Our History and Photographs. Thank you to Mrs. Christina Reed, Mr. Dwayne Penner, and Mrs. Heather Peters for providing those books. Special thank yous go to Mrs. Helen Singer and Mrs. Christina Reed, who is the Executive Director of the Heritage Abbotsford Society. And a big thank you to my mom and my sister who supported me throughout the entire course of this project. Thank you.
Thank you, Priyam. That was a really interesting presentation. I really enjoyed learning about this. I actually have a few questions for you. So, what is the most important thing that you learned about your project and your school?
One of the most important things that I learned about this was about history actually. I learned that it's not just something to learn in class and then later forget just because you're studying for a test. I learned that it's something that we all need to understand and learn, and whoever doesn't respect it, they're bound to repeat it.
That's a very nice answer. I want to ask you, what was the most coolest fact that you learned about doing your research?
I learned a lot of facts. One of the facts that I learned was that kids back then only brought to school what they grew at home. So, for example, if they grew apples, they would probably have apples for their lunch along with other stuff. If they would make homemade bread, they would have homemade jam. If they had pigs, they would have pork, ham. So it would be a lot less processed, so you knew what you were eating.
That's a really interesting fact. As for the research project, did you feel like there were any sources that were helpful in trying to get information?
I've got to say, Mrs. Christina Reed and Mrs. Helen Singer were a huge help to my project. About probably half of this information probably came from them. There were also the books that I mentioned in the acknowledgements. Those were also a big help. And then there were the various teachers that helped me a lot.
Yeah, first and second resources are really important. Thank you, Priyam, for presenting. I learned a lot, and I'd actually like to learn more about your school. So, thank you.
Thank you. There is actually one more thing.
Hmm?
As you can see here, I'm in an outfit that is what boys from the 1930s would typically wear while going to school.
I see. Is this part of the traditional element that your school is trying to include?
No, in the 1930s, this would just be what they typically wore. The school became traditional in 2003. That's when the students had to start wearing uniforms.
I see. Thank you for sharing this, Priyam, and I really enjoyed learning about your presentation. And with that, we'll end it.
Thank you.